It didn't start with an election. It didn't start with a war. It didn't even start with a crisis. America lost its financial freedom on a quiet night, far from Washington, far from Wall Street, on a private island wrapped in fog and silence. The damage didn't explode. It seeped, slowly, invisibly, through every dollar, every debt, every generation that followed. By the time the public realized something was wrong, the chains were already locked. The story begins at the end, a nation drowning in debt, a currency that buys less each year, an economy addicted to money created out of thin air. Families working harder just to stay afloat, a middle class shrinking like a shadow at sunset. Wealth concentrating upward, not by accident, but by design. The system feels rigged because it is rigged. And the blueprint of that rigging traces back to a secluded mansion on Jekyll Island. In the present day, Americans sense the trap tightening, prices rising faster than wages, government borrowing trillions it can never repay, banks growing larger even after catastrophes they caused. It all feels unnatural, coordinated, because it is. The machinery that drives this economy isn't democratic, it isn't constitutional, it isn't accountable. It is a structure built by men who understood one thing with perfect clarity. Control the money, and you control the nation. But the public never saw the moment that control began. They never saw the men who gathered in secret. They never heard the agreements whispered in that isolated retreat. They never witnessed the moment when America's financial destiny was quietly handed from its people to a private cartel operating under the guise of public service. The consequences echo through every corner of modern life. Your savings lose value year after year. Your taxes never catch up. Your government grows while your purchasing power shrinks. Booms and busts hit like engineered storms, predictable to some, devastating to others. Every recession feels suspiciously convenient. Every bailout flows upward, never downward. Every crisis ends with more centralization, more control, more dependency. These outcomes aren't random. They are the shadow of a decision made long ago. On that night, America didn't sign a law, it signed a contract. A contract that bound the nation to perpetual debt. A contract that handed the power of money creation to private interests. A contract that transformed the US dollar from a symbol of strength into a tool of manipulation. Most people today have never heard of Jekyll Island, but they live inside its consequences. The inflation eroding their paychecks, the cycles of collapse and rescue, the endless expansion of government spending, the quiet extraction of wealth from the many to the few. All of it leads back to that hidden meeting, where America didn't just lose control of its money, it lost control of its future. And what began as a secret would grow into the most powerful financial institution on earth, one that answers to no voter, no audit, no democratic restraint. This is how a nation is captured, not by invasion, not by revolution, but by a pen scratching across paper in a room no one was supposed to enter. The night America lost its freedom wasn't loud. It was quiet, deliberate, calculated. And the cage built on Jekyll Island still surrounds us today. Every nation imagines its sovereignty is secured by borders, armies, and constitutions. But history reveals a different truth. A nation's real power lives or dies with its currency. The moment control of that currency slips away, the nation follows. Collapse doesn't begin with gunfire. It begins with ink, with printing, with quiet decisions made in the shadows of treasuries and banks. And the pattern is so old, so predictable, that historians barely bother to debate it anymore. When a nation gives its money to private hands, its destiny is no longer its own. Look back through time. Every fallen empire shares the same three-part sequence, a tragic rhythm repeating across centuries. Step 1. Money is manipulated. Rome clipped its coins to fund endless expansion, weakening the silver content until the denarius became a joke. France printed the livre into oblivion before its revolution erupted. The Weimar Republic flooded its economy with marks until wheelbarrows were worth more than the cash they carried. Whenever leaders discover they can conjure money without limits, they always do, and the currency always dies. Step 2. Debt consumes the state. Once money loses its anchor, debt becomes the lifeline. Nations borrow to survive, borrow to fight wars, borrow to soothe the public, borrow to cover the consequences of earlier borrowing. Debt begins as a tool of growth. It ends as a tool of dependency. Look at the Ottoman Empire, Spain's collapsed fortunes, the Habsburg decline. Every empire that traded discipline for debt lost its sovereignty long before its enemies arrived at the gates. Step 3. Private power steps in. When governments break the value of money, private bankers replace it with systems they control. It happened when the Bank of England emerged after financial chaos. It happened when European monarchies surrendered monetary authority to creditor families. It happened when nations in crisis allowed central banks to dictate policy, rewriting their economies from the outside in. This is the universal ending. Broken states turn to private rescuers and become their prisoners. The pattern never changes because the incentives never change. Inflation transfers wealth upward. Debt creates dependency. Crises concentrate power. And in every historical case, the public pays the cost while elites write the rules. History's message is mercilessly consistent. The moment a country no longer controls its currency, it no longer controls its future. The people lose purchasing power. The government loses independence. The economy becomes a hostage, and the nation becomes an asset, managed, not governed. We pretend this is modern. It isn't. We pretend this is complicated. It isn't. It is the oldest con in civilization. Engineer a crisis, then offer stability in exchange for control. That's how Rome slid into empire. That's how Britain accepted a central bank. That's how monarchies across Europe surrendered their economic sovereignty to small circles of financiers. The tragedy is not that nations fall. The tragedy is that they fall the same way, over and over. Because money is the bloodstream of a civilization. Control the money, and you control everything built on top of it: law, labor, trade, war, government itself. And America, like every empire before it, was not immune to the pattern. It believed it was exceptional. It believed it was untouchable. But in 1910, on a secluded island far from public eyes, it walked willingly into the same trap that devoured the civilizations before it. The moment the U.S. surrendered its monetary power, its sovereignty began to erode. Quietly, patiently, inevitably. History warned us. America did not listen. What happened on Jekyll Island is not ancient history. It is a script that is repeating itself in real time. The same mechanisms, the same loopholes, the same quiet consolidations of power are unfolding again, almost line for line, like a pattern America refuses to break. The difference is simple. In 1910, the trap was built in secret. Today, it is happening in plain sight. Look around. Every symptom of the original scheme has returned, only bigger, faster, and more dangerous. The first parallel is the printing press. In 1913, after the Federal Reserve was created, the dollar slowly began to detach from reality. Today, the detachment is complete. Trillions appear out of nowhere with a keystroke. Stimulus packages, quantitative easing, emergency liquidity. Different names for the same act. Manufacturing money without accountability. And just like in earlier cycles, the printing is sold as temporary until it becomes permanent. Temporary inflation, temporary deficits, temporary interventions. But the consequences are forever. Every new dollar reduces the value of every dollar already earned. Inflation isn't a mistake, it's a harvest. The second parallel is national debt, a monster the men of Jekyll Island secretly anticipated. Their system required the government to borrow endlessly, because the debt is where the real power lives. In 1910, national debt was a manageable burden. Today, it is a weapon. Trillions stack on trillions. Debt ceilings rise on schedule like ritual observances. Future generations are bound to obligations no one voted for. And every dollar borrowed strengthens the institution that lends it. the Federal Reserve. The borrower becomes the servant. The lender becomes the master. This was the design. Then comes asset consolidation, a phenomenon that exploded after the foundations were laid on Jekyll Island. The same banks that once met in secrecy now sit at the top of a pyramid where wealth flows upward with chilling efficiency. Homes absorbed by investment firms. Small businesses devoured by multinational corporations. Savings eroded by inflation. Every crisis, 2008, 2020, 2023, achieved the same outcome. The big players grew bigger. The small players disappeared. It mirrors what happened after the Fed's creation, only now the machine is global. The fourth parallel is manipulated cycles. The Federal Reserve was designed to stabilize the economy, but the pattern reveals something darker: boom and bust cycles that transfer ownership during each collapse. The Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, the post-war booms and the stagflation of the 1970s, the tech bubble, the housing bubble. Each crisis conveniently strengthened the Federal Reserve's reach. Today's volatility is no different. When markets fall, power rises, just never in the hands of citizens. And then there is surveillance, the modern version of the secrecy that surrounded the Jekyll Island meeting. In 1910, the danger was private men controlling public money. In 2023 and beyond, the danger is private institutions controlling public data and merging it with public money. Digital tracking, bank monitoring, algorithmic profiling, all of it feeding into the next phase, central bank digital currency. CBDCs are the clearest parallel of all. They are the modern version of what the Jekyll Island conspirators built, except this time the control is absolute. A currency that is programmable, traceable, and revocable is not a currency. It is a leash. Jekyll Island created the structure. CBDCs perfect it. Even the political theater mirrors the past. Back then, the Federal Reserve Act was sold as a way to protect ordinary Americans from bankers, when it was written by bankers. Today, new financial regulations are sold as protections, while quietly expanding the same cartel's reach. The propaganda has evolved, but the intent has not. And perhaps the most disturbing parallel is public ignorance, not by accident, but by design. In 1910, the public didn't know the meeting took place. In 2023, the public doesn't understand the system controlling their lives, because confusion is part of the architecture. The complexity is deliberate. The secrecy is deliberate. The distance from ordinary citizens is deliberate. America is not witnessing a new crisis. It is watching the original strategy of Jekyll Island reach its final global stage. The same pattern, the same structure, the same invisible hands. The playbook hasn't changed, only the scale. They didn't arrive as villains. They arrived as gentlemen, wealthy, connected, discreet. Their names carried weight on Wall Street and in Washington. But history remembers them not for their titles, not for their legacy, but for the night they slipped into the shadows, boarded a private train, and rewrote the fate of America without a single vote cast. These were the men who designed the cage. The public knows fragments of the story: a secret meeting, a secluded island, a mysterious bill. But the truth is far sharper. What happened on Jekyll Island in 1910 was not a discussion. It was an operation, one engineered with military precision by the most powerful financial interests in the country. What emerged from that island was the blueprint for a system of control disguised as reform. And every one of the architects had something to gain. Senator Nelson Aldrich, the political mastermind, arrived with a mission: to deliver America's monetary system into the hands of the bankers he trusted more than the public he represented. He was no neutral party. He was tied by blood to the Rockefellers. His daughter married into the dynasty that would dominate American finance for decades. Aldrich wasn't just shaping policy, he was securing generational power. Paul Warburg, the quiet architect and the true intellectual force behind the plan, was a German-born banker who understood central banking better than any man in America. He knew the model. He had studied the European systems controlled by private interests. He believed absolute power over money should belong to experts like him. Warburg didn't simply advise the group, he authored its doctrine. Henry P. Davison, the right hand of J.P. Morgan, was the organizer, the enforcer, the strategist. His loyalty was to the Morgan Empire, the financial colossus that had already saved the U.S. government from collapse in 1907. Davison understood leverage. He knew that true power was not in owning money, but in controlling its creation. Jekyll Island was his opportunity to formalize that power forever. Frank Vanderlip, representing the Rockefeller interests, came as the voice of the biggest banking networks in the country. He later admitted the truth that the public never learned. They were instructed to use fake names, to conceal their mission, to avoid detection at all costs. Vanderlip's presence ensured that America's most powerful oil and banking dynasty would have a direct hand in designing the nation's financial future. Benjamin Strong, the Morgan's rising star, brought the operational expertise. He later became the first head of the New York Federal Reserve, the most powerful branch in the system they created. Strong didn't just help write the plan, he became its executor. Together, these men formed a cartel, not a metaphorical one, but a literal coalition of private banking interests united to build a central bank they would quietly dominate. They traveled in secrecy. They used first names only. They denied the meeting existed. For decades, they lied about their role. Because they knew exactly what they were doing. They were taking the most important power granted to Congress, the power to create money, and transferring it to a private institution designed to look public. They were creating a system that would insulate bankers from accountability while making the American people responsible for every risk, every crisis, every bailout. The Federal Reserve was framed as a safeguard. It was built as a shield for them. Its structure ensured that real authority flowed through regional banks controlled by private shareholders. That monetary policy could be dictated by unelected individuals. That transparency would be minimal, independence maximal, and influence untouchable. The men of Jekyll Island didn't just write the Federal Reserve Act. They wrote the operating manual of modern America, a nation powered by debt, a currency fueled by inflation, a government dependent on private lenders. An economy that rises and falls at the discretion of a small, insulated circle. The genius of their design was in its illusion. It looked democratic. It sounded patriotic. It was anything but. Every major financial event since, booms, busts, rescues, collapses, has funneled wealth from the public to the private institutions these men represented. And the leaders of today still stand on the foundation they built. Every rate decision, every stimulus program, every monetary intervention. All of it traces back to the moment a handful of men sat in a smoke-filled room and decided that America's money should no longer belong to America. The public sees the effects, they rarely see the architects. But history remembers, and the names of those men, Aldrich, Warburg, Davison, Vanderlip, Strong, are written into the architecture of the system that continues to shape the nation's destiny. They didn't seize power, they designed it. And they did it knowing that once the structure was in place, the American people would spend the next century trying to understand a prison built so elegantly that most never realize they're inside it. By the time Americans discovered the truth about Jekyll Island, the system was already a century old, entrenched, protected, disguised as stability. And yet, for all its power, for all its reach, the greatest vulnerability of the system is the same weakness every empire has faced. People eventually wake up. The men who met on that island built a machine of control, one that could drain wealth quietly, influence policy invisibly, and shape the nation's future without democratic consent. But they made one critical miscalculation. They assumed the public would never understand what had been done to them. They believed complexity itself was a cage. But history tells another story. Every time centralized financial power grows too large, too arrogant, too insulated, it collapses under its own weight. The system becomes so fragile, so over-leveraged, so dependent on illusion, that a single spark, an awakening, a crisis, a shift in public consciousness can unravel what was built in secret. And that unraveling has already begun. People see the inflation, they see the bubbles, they see the bailouts, they see the wealth extraction masked as policy. They know something is wrong, even if they can't articulate the architecture behind it. Awareness is the first fracture. Once it appears, the rest of the structure begins to shake. The inevitability is not the survival of the system, it is its decay. No empire based on debt has ever endured. No currency managed in secrecy has ever kept its value. No cartel has ever permanently controlled the will of a free people. And so the cycle turns. As confidence erodes, alternatives emerge, not from institutions, but from individuals. Not from Washington, but from communities, innovators, and outsiders who refuse to play by the rules written on that island. Decentralized technologies, sound money, blockchain networks, peer-to-peer exchanges chip away at the monopoly over money creation. They offer a form of sovereignty the Jekyll Island architects never anticipated. A financial system without gatekeepers, without middlemen, without a central throne of power. Local resilience grows too. Communities rediscover what the founders understood intuitively, that real strength comes from dispersion, not concentration. People learn to store value differently, trade differently, build differently. The future stops being something done to them and becomes something they can build for themselves. And slowly, the spell breaks. Not all at once, not through revolution, but through a quiet, unstoppable shift in understanding. Because once people see the cage, they start searching for the door. And once they find it, no amount of policy, propaganda, or engineered crisis can force them back inside. This is the hope. Not naive optimism, not blind faith. A sober, historical truth. Centralized power is a temporary phenomenon. Decentralized power is the natural state of a free society. The men of Jekyll Island forged a chain strong enough to bind a nation for generations. But no chain, no matter how elegantly engineered, survives the moment people recognize it as a chain. The next chapter of America will not be written by bankers in private rooms. It will be written by individuals reclaiming the one thing they were never meant to understand, that monetary sovereignty begins when the illusion ends. The architects of the past built the system. The people of the present will outgrow it. And the future belongs to those who refuse to be ruled by secrets. The cage was crafted in darkness, but the escape begins with a single light: awareness.